Ethan Cross had always been a man of subtlety. Unlike the stereotypical CEO who reveled in the spotlight, Ethan preferred to operate in the shadows. He believed that true power lay in observation, in understanding the nuances of his company without the filter of people trying to impress him. At 36, he was young for a CEO, but his strategic mind and business acumen had already made him a legend in the tech industry. His company, NexGen Innovations, was one of the most respected firms in Silicon Valley, known for its cutting-edge technology and innovative solutions. Ethan's approach to leadership was unconventional. He didn't demand attention or flaunt his status. In fact, most of his employees, especially the newer ones, had no idea what he looked like. He didn't plaster his face across press releases or corporate newsletters. His name carried weight in the industry, but his face remained relatively unknown outside of high-level business circles. It was a deliberate choice, one that allowed him to see his company as it truly was, without the distortion of people putting on a show for the boss. That morning, as Ethan stepped into the sleek, modern lobby of NexGen's headquarters, he blended in effortlessly. Dressed casually in dark jeans, a fitted button-down shirt, and a jacket that could belong to any mid-level manager, he looked like just another employee. No suit, no tie, nothing that screamed executive. The reception area was a controlled bustle of activity, employees moving with purpose, phones ringing in the background, and conversations layered on top of each other like white noise. No one paid him any particular attention, which was exactly what he wanted. Ethan had returned to the office after an extended period of working remotely, dealing with high-stakes negotiations overseas. The months away had given him a fresh perspective, but he knew that in his absence, certain shifts had taken place within the company, subtle changes in dynamics that could only be understood by observing them firsthand. The most significant of those changes had been the restructuring of the contracts department, a critical segment of the business responsible for overseeing deals worth millions. New leadership had been installed, and today, Ethan intended to see how things were running under their control. As he made his way toward the elevators, a sharp voice cut through the air, snapping at someone nearby. You? Yes, you. Standing there like you have all the time in the world. Do you have nothing better to do? Ethan turned his head slightly, catching sight of a woman striding through the lobby with an air of absolute entitlement. She was in her early 40s, immaculately dressed in a tailored blazer and pencil skirt, her blonde hair styled into a sleek, almost intimidating bob. Everything about her demeanor screamed authority, but not the kind earned through respect. Rather, the kind imposed through sheer force of will. Laura Bennett, Ethan thought. The name rang a bell. He recalled seeing her file when she had been hired as the new head of the contracts division. There had been nothing particularly alarming in her background, at least, nothing that stood out enough to warrant concern. Yet, as he observed her now, something about her set off a warning in his mind. She marched straight toward him, her expression twisted in irritation. Are you deaf or just slow? I said, do you have nothing better to do? Ethan raised an eyebrow, keeping his expression neutral. Excuse me. Laura exhaled sharply, as if speaking to him was an unbearable inconvenience. I need someone to run these documents to legal, and since you're standing here doing nothing, congratulations, you just volunteered. She thrust a thick folder toward him, expecting him to take it without question. He didn't move. I think you might be mistaking me for someone else. Her expression darkened. Oh, for God's sake, don't tell me you're another one of those fragile types who need their hand held for every little task. This isn't complicated. Take the folder, walk to the legal department, drop it off. I swear, interns get lazier every year. Interns. Ethan almost laughed. Almost. It wasn't the first time he had been mistaken for someone lower on the corporate ladder, and he rarely felt the need to correct people. He never had an ego about these things. Titles didn't impress him, and he had no desire to wield his authority just for the sake of it. But there was something about Laura's tone, the sheer condescension, the way she assumed the world owed her obedience, that struck him the wrong way. He met her gaze evenly. I'm not an intern. Laura rolled her eyes. Then what are you? Middle management? Some new hire from one of those overpriced MBA programs? Whatever. Doesn't matter. If you work here, you take orders. Now, take the damn folder and get moving. Ethan let a slow smile form, though there was no warmth in it. And if I don't? Laura's nostrils flared slightly, her patience thinning. Then you're wasting my time. Before he could reply, she did something that made the entire room go silent. She slapped him. It wasn't a full-force hit meant to injure, but it was sharp enough that the sound echoed in the suddenly hushed lobby. A few employees had stopped mid-conversation, turning their heads in stunned disbelief. Ethan barely moved. His jaw clenched for half a second, but otherwise, he remained exactly where he was, his expression unreadable. Laura tilted her chin upward, clearly expecting some kind of reaction, maybe fear, maybe anger, maybe even submission. Instead, Ethan just exhaled slowly. I'm going to give you a piece of advice, he said, his voice calm. You might want to be very, very sure of who you're talking to before you put your hands on them. Something in his tone, something measured, something controlled, finally seemed to register with her. There was a flicker of uncertainty in her eyes, just for a moment, before it disappeared behind her usual arrogance. Oh, please, she scoffed. What are you going to do? Run to HR? Complain to someone higher up? Ethan just smiled, but this time, there was something almost dangerous in the way he did it. Something like that. And with that, he walked away, leaving Laura standing there, still holding the folder, her face frozen in confusion. As he stepped into the elevator and pressed the button for the top floor, he heard the murmurs starting behind him, whispers among the employees who had witnessed the exchange. Laura might have thought she was the one in control. She had no idea who she had just slapped. And soon enough, she was going to find out. Chapter 2. The Unraveling. Ethan didn't look back as the elevator doors slid shut, sealing him off from the murmuring voices and the disbelieving stares of the employees who had just witnessed what might have been the biggest mistake of Laura Bennett's career. He felt the lingering sting of the slap, not from pain, but from the sheer audacity of it. There was something almost amusing about it, if he detached himself from the situation. How a woman who had been with the company for barely a few months had the nerve to treat anyone that way, let alone the person who owned the entire operation. It wasn't the slap itself that fascinated him. It was the entitlement, the arrogance, the absolute certainty in her mind that she could get away with it without consequence. That certainty was about to shatter, and Ethan would ensure that when it did, the impact would be loud enough for everyone to hear. The elevator hummed as it ascended toward the executive floor, the cool interior a stark contrast to the heated energy of the confrontation downstairs. Ethan's reflection stared back at him from the polished steel of the doors, his expression unreadable. He had encountered difficult employees before, had dealt with egos inflated beyond reason, but Laura was something different. She wasn't just a bad hire. She was a problem, a potentially dangerous one. Ethan had no patience for toxicity in the workplace, and from the way she had spoken, from the sheer aggression in her tone, he knew this wasn't an isolated incident. She hadn't just mistaken him for an intern. She had revealed something much deeper about how she operated, how she viewed the people around her. That was something that couldn't be ignored. When the doors finally slid open, Ethan stepped out into the executive corridor, greeted by the familiar scent of freshly brewed coffee and the low hum of conversation from his senior staff. The headquarters of NexGen Innovations had been designed with efficiency in mind: sleek glass walls, polished wood accents, open spaces that encouraged collaboration. It was a place that ran like a machine, precise and disciplined. But now, standing in his own office, Ethan wondered how much had slipped through the cracks in his absence. The first call he made was to the head of human resources. I need you to pull up the full employment file on Laura Bennett, he said, leaning against his desk, fingers tapping absently against the surface. There was a brief hesitation on the other end of the line before the voice responded, professional but cautious. Of course, sir. Would you like a summary, or do you want everything? Everything, Ethan said. Every detail. And I want to know if there have been any complaints filed against her since she started working here. Another pause. Understood. I'll have the file sent to you within the hour. He ended the call, exhaling slowly. There was no need to rush this. No need to storm down to her office and demand an explanation. That wasn't how he worked. He had learned long ago that the best way to deal with people like Laura wasn't with immediate confrontation, but with methodical precision. If there was something off about her, he would find out exactly what it was before making his next move. 30 minutes later, his inbox lit up with the HR report. Ethan opened the file and scanned through the neatly organized documents, his eyes narrowing slightly as he took in the details. On paper, Laura Bennett had an impressive resume. Degrees from prestigious universities, a history of working with high-profile firms, glowing recommendations. Everything looked perfect, almost too perfect. He frowned, clicking on the internal complaint log. And that was when the first real red flag appeared. 3 complaints had been filed against her in the past 2 months. One from an employee in the contracts department, stating that Laura had pressured them into pushing through a deal without the proper approvals. Another from a junior analyst, claiming she had berated them in front of an entire team for asking a question about policy compliance. The third, more alarming than the others, was an anonymous submission detailing verbal abuse, intimidation, and an accusation that Laura had manipulated contract details to benefit an external party. Ethan leaned back in his chair, considering the implications. 3 complaints in 2 months, all ignored, all dismissed without further action. That wasn't just an oversight, that was negligence. Someone had buried these. Someone had made sure they didn't escalate beyond the initial reports. And now, with what had happened in the lobby, it was clear that Laura believed she was untouchable. That illusion wouldn't last much longer. Instead of confronting her immediately, Ethan called in another department, corporate security. His head of security, a man named Victor Kane, had been with the company since its early days and had a reputation for being thorough, meticulous, and completely unshakable. If there was something deeper going on, if Laura's influence extended beyond just office politics, Victor would find it. "I need a discreet review of Laura Bennett's activities in the company," Ethan instructed when Victor entered his office. "Something's not adding up, and I want to know why." Victor, a man in his late 40s with the calculating eyes of someone who had seen more than his fair share of corporate warfare, nodded once. "Are we talking financials? Personnel? External connections?" "All of the above," Ethan said. Victor didn't ask why. He simply nodded again. "Give me a few hours." Ethan appreciated that about him. No unnecessary questions, no drawn-out discussions, just results. Hours later, when Victor returned, his expression was unreadable, but there was a certain weight in his stance that told Ethan what he already suspected. This wasn't just an issue of a bad hire. This was something deeper, something calculated. "You were right to look into her," Victor said, dropping a file onto Ethan's desk. "Laura Bennett isn't who she says she is." Ethan exhaled slowly, flipping open the folder. What he saw made his blood run cold. There were inconsistencies in her employment history, gaps that had been carefully patched over with falsified records. The companies she claimed to have worked for had no record of her. The reference letters in her resume had been fabricated. Even her university credentials, while technically real, had minor discrepancies that suggested forgery. But the most damning piece of information was buried in a financial audit Victor had run through corporate accounts. Laura had been authorizing contracts with external vendors, companies with no verifiable track record, no legitimate operations. Money had been moving, siphoned into accounts that looped through multiple shell corporations before disappearing entirely. Ethan's fingers tightened slightly around the edge of the folder. This wasn't just corporate arrogance. This wasn't just an overconfident manager throwing her weight around. This was fraud. Laura Bennett had embedded herself in his company, manipulated systems, intimidated employees, and had started funneling money out before anyone had the chance to notice. And worse, someone else had been covering for her. Someone high enough in the company to bury complaints, override security checks, and give her the power she had been flaunting. Ethan closed the folder, his mind sharpening with cold focus. She thought she was untouchable. She was about to find out how wrong she was. Chapter 3. The Fall. Ethan sat in silence for a long moment, his fingers resting lightly against the edge of the folder, his mind working through the implications of everything Victor had just laid before him. The initial confrontation with Laura had been little more than an annoyance, an unfortunate interaction with an employee who had let power warp her perception of her own importance. But this changed everything. She wasn't just a toxic manager who abused her authority and treated people like stepping stones beneath her heels. She was something far worse. She was a parasite that had latched onto the company, burrowing in under a carefully constructed false identity and manipulating finances and systems that should have flagged her immediately. The fact that she had gotten this far without detection meant only one thing. Someone had cleared the way for her. Ethan exhaled slowly, methodically, his mind running through the next steps with the precision of a surgeon about to make his first incision. There were no immediate outbursts, no emotional reactions. This wasn't about pride or personal offense anymore. It was about something much bigger, something that had the potential to cost the company millions and, if he didn't act carefully, erode the trust of clients who expected absolute security when they did business with him. A scandal like this, if handled poorly, could spiral out of control, dragging down not just Laura, but anyone who had been complicit in her actions. He couldn't afford to make a single misstep. His first move was to tighten the circle. Information was power, and right now, the fewer people who knew the full extent of what was happening, the better. Victor was a vault. He had no concern about leaks from that front. HR had already flagged Laura as problematic, but they hadn't known the full extent of it. That meant at least one high-level executive had been running interference, making sure any suspicions were quietly silenced before they could turn into real inquiries. There was no telling how far that influence reached, so Ethan chose his next contact carefully. He picked up the phone and dialed Marcus Dillard, the company's chief financial officer. The man had been with him since the early days of the firm, had helped structure its entire financial framework, and had never once given Ethan a reason to question his loyalty or integrity. If there was a financial hole somewhere in their operations, Marcus would find it. If anyone had been authorizing payments without scrutiny, Marcus would know. The call connected on the second ring. "Ethan," Marcus said, his voice steady but with the slight edge of someone who knew a request was coming. "Didn't expect to hear from you today. I thought you were still in meetings. I need you to do something for me," Ethan said evenly, ignoring the small talk. Quietly. No flags, no alerts. "I need a forensic audit of every contract Laura Bennett has had a hand in since she started here. Look for anything unusual, discrepancies, vendor information, money moving into unverified accounts. Anything that doesn't match standard protocol. And I need it as soon as possible." There was a slight pause. Then Marcus exhaled through his nose. "That's a hell of a request. What am I looking for?" "Fraud," Ethan said simply. "She's been siphoning money out through fake vendors, and someone inside has been covering for her." That got Marcus's full attention. His tone sharpened. "How much are we talking?" "I don't know yet," Ethan said. "That's why I need you on this. Start from the beginning of her employment and work your way forward." "And Marcus," Ethan's voice dropped slightly, "don't tell anyone else. If someone in finance has been helping her, the last thing we need is them knowing we're on to them." Another pause, then a curt nod. "Understood. Give me a few hours." Ethan hung up without another word. Now, it was time for the next step. Chapter 4. The Confrontation. Ethan left his office and moved with purpose through the executive corridors, keeping his expression neutral, his posture relaxed, nothing that would suggest anything was amiss. If Laura was working with someone inside the company, then whoever it was would be watching closely for any signs that the walls were closing in. The last thing he wanted to do was tip them off too soon. He took the elevator down to the contracts division, where Laura's office was located. The atmosphere in the department was noticeably different from the rest of the building. There was an underlying tension in the air, a stiffness in the way employees moved, as if they were always walking on the edge of some invisible threat. That more than anything else confirmed Ethan's suspicions. Toxic leadership bled into the culture of an office like a slow poison, turning what should have been a place of productivity into an environment of quiet fear. He passed by the rows of desks, his sharp gaze flicking from one employee to the next, noting the way eyes darted toward him before quickly shifting away. Most of them didn't recognize him. They only saw a man in an expensive, well-fitted suit, someone important enough to warrant curiosity but not immediate acknowledgement. That worked to his advantage. He stopped at the desk of a woman who looked like she had been holding her breath all morning. She was young, mid-20s, her ID badge clipped neatly to her blazer, hands nervously tapping against the edge of her keyboard. He glanced at the nameplate on her desk. "Rachel," he said smoothly, and she jolted slightly, clearly not expecting to be addressed. "Could you tell me if Laura is in her office?" Rachel swallowed visibly. She just stepped out for a meeting." Ethan gave a small, knowing smile. "That's convenient." Rachel shifted uncomfortably in her seat. He could see the hesitation in her expression, the internal debate playing out behind her eyes. She was debating whether it was worth the risk to say anything further. "Rachel," Ethan said, lowering his voice just enough to make it feel like a private conversation. "You don't have to tell me anything you're not comfortable with. But if there's something going on here, something that isn't right, I need to know." For a long moment, she didn't speak. Then, finally, she inhaled sharply and glanced around, as if making sure no one else was listening. "She's been pushing contracts through without approvals," Rachel whispered. "She tells us not to question them. If we do, she threatens to fire us." Ethan's gaze darkened. "Who else knows about this?" "No one," Rachel said. "No one says anything. We're all too afraid." That was all he needed to hear. Ethan straightened, smoothing the cuffs of his sleeves. "Thank you, Rachel. You don't need to worry. This is being handled." As he turned and walked away, his mind was already shifting toward the next phase. Marcus would be gathering the financial evidence. Victor was tracking the security breaches. Now, all that remained was the final step, bringing Laura face to face with everything she had done and watching her realize that no matter how carefully she had planned, she had made one critical error. She had assumed no one would notice. She had assumed she could intimidate people into silence. And worst of all, she had assumed that she knew who held the real power in this company. She was about to find out exactly how wrong she had been. Chapter 5: The Reckoning. Ethan sat in his office, fingers steepled together as he stared at the glowing screen in front of him. The data Marcus had pulled was damning. The financial audit had traced over $2 million funneled into unregistered shell companies, all authorized under contracts that Laura had pushed through with minimal oversight. Some of the names on the vendor list didn't even exist in legitimate business registries, and others were nothing more than P.O. boxes linked to offshore accounts. The fraudulent payments were staggered in amounts that weren't large enough to immediately trigger red flags, but when combined, painted a picture of a slow, deliberate siphoning of company funds. Someone had clearly been helping her cover her tracks, authorizing transactions, overriding internal alerts, and ensuring that no one asked too many questions. Ethan leaned back in his chair, his mind methodically dissecting every angle. Laura had made a fatal miscalculation. She had assumed that she could operate unchecked, that fear and intimidation would be enough to keep people quiet, and that no one would ever look too closely at the paperwork she had been manipulating. What she hadn't accounted for was him. She hadn't known who he was when she slapped him in the lobby. And even now, as he orchestrated the walls closing in around her, she still had no idea just how completely she was about to be dismantled. The confirmation he had been waiting for arrived in the form of a text from Victor. "Got something. Need to meet." That was all he needed. He grabbed his jacket, left his office without a word, and took the private elevator down to the restricted floor where corporate security handled its most sensitive investigations. The security wing was stark and clinical, a place where secrets were dissected and threats were neutralized before they could ever reach the surface. Victor was already waiting for him, a thick dossier open on the glass conference table, the dim overhead lights reflecting off the glossy pages. Without preamble, he gestured for Ethan to sit and flipped to a page marked with a red tab. "We found the connection," Victor said, his voice clipped and professional but carrying the weight of something significant. Laura wasn't working alone. She's been coordinating with someone in the executive branch. Ethan's expression remained unreadable, but a flicker of something cold passed through his gaze. "Who?" Victor slid a document across the table. "Mark Deo." Ethan exhaled slowly, absorbing the information. Mark was the vice president of finance, a polished, well-spoken executive who had been with the company for years. He had always positioned himself as an indispensable part of the financial operations, someone who ensured compliance while maintaining efficiency. But now, looking at the evidence in front of him, it was clear that Mark had been more than just an enabler. He had been actively covering for Laura, approving payments, bypassing internal security measures, and making sure that the stolen funds were laundered through accounts too convoluted for a surface-level audit to catch. Victor continued, flipping to another page. This started before Laura was even hired. Deo had already been setting up the infrastructure for these payments months in advance. She was brought in to execute the plan, but he's the architect. Ethan nodded slowly. "And Laura doesn't know we have this." No, Victor said. As far as we can tell, she still thinks she's untouchable. She has no idea how much we've already uncovered. That was exactly how Ethan wanted it. Laura had spent months believing she was in control, believing that the people beneath her were too weak or too afraid to challenge her. Now, she was about to experience something far worse than fear, powerlessness. He glanced at Victor. Shut her out of the system immediately. I want every one of her credentials revoked, every access point locked down. I want security stationed outside her office. She doesn't leave the building until I say so. Victor gave a sharp nod and pulled out his phone. Within minutes, the lockdown was in effect. Ethan could already picture Laura sitting at her desk, oblivious to the fact that her entire operation was crumbling in real time. She would try to log in and find herself locked out. She would call IT and be told that there was a hold on her account. Then, the realization would set in, and by the time she started to panic, it would already be too late. He didn't give her the satisfaction of a dramatic confrontation. He let her stew in the silence, in the growing sense of unease, as the walls she had built around herself started collapsing one by one. It wasn't until an hour later, when she finally marched up to the executive floor, furious and demanding answers, that he decided to let her see just how completely she had lost. She stormed past his assistant, ignoring the protests, and pushed open his office door without knocking. "What the hell is going on?" she snapped, her voice sharp with barely restrained anger. Ethan didn't look up immediately. He finished the email he was typing, took his time closing his laptop, then slowly lifted his gaze to meet hers. "Good afternoon, Laura," he said, his voice calm, steady, completely in control. She was breathing hard, clearly expecting some kind of resistance or an argument she could overpower. But the moment stretched too long, and doubt flickered in her eyes. "I can't access the system," she said, trying to regain control of the conversation. "My credentials aren't working. IT isn't answering my calls. You need to tell me what's happening right now." Ethan exhaled softly and leaned back in his chair, studying her. "Laura," he said, his tone almost conversational, "do you know what the biggest mistake people make when they try to steal from companies like mine?" The shift in conversation caught her off guard. "What?" "They assume no one is watching." He let that sink in for a moment before continuing. "They assume that the people beneath them are too scared to speak up. They assume that the money they're moving will go unnoticed, that their access won't raise red flags, that the person in charge is too far removed to ever pay attention." Laura's face paled slightly, but she recovered quickly. "I don't know what you're implying, but I suggest you think very carefully before you throw around accusations without evidence." Ethan smiled, but there was no warmth in it. "Oh, we have evidence." He gestured toward the folder on his desk. "Enough to make sure you never work in this industry again. Enough to make sure Mark Deo is sitting in a courtroom before the month is over." Her lip parted slightly, and for the first time, Ethan saw something crack beneath the surface, not anger, but fear. "You've been locked out," he continued. "Every account, every system, every financial trail you thought you covered, we found. Every contract you manipulated, we traced. Every company you funneled money to, we shut down." He leaned forward slightly, his voice dropping just enough to make the room feel colder. "You don't have a way out, Laura. You don't have leverage. You have nothing." She opened her mouth, then closed it, as if scrambling for a move that no longer existed. Ethan straightened, smoothing the cuffs of his shirt. "Security will escort you out. You won't be coming back." Laura stood there for a long moment, as if trying to process how quickly everything had fallen apart. Then, with the stiff, mechanical movements of someone whose world had just been ripped out from under her, she turned and walked toward the door. But before she reached it, Ethan spoke one last time. "Oh, and Laura." She hesitated but didn't turn around. "Slapping an intern might get you fired," he said, smiling slightly. "Slapping the owner of the company? That's just embarrassing." And with that, she walked out, her career and everything she had built reduced to nothing. Chapter 6. The Aftermath. Ethan watched the door close behind Laura with the quiet satisfaction of a strategist who had just played the perfect move. There was no need for shouting, no need for theatrics. He had always believed that the most devastating defeats were the ones that came not in a fit of rage, but in the cold, methodical unraveling of someone's illusions. Laura had built her career on arrogance, intimidation, and the false certainty that she could manipulate her way through any situation. That certainty had shattered in his office, and by the time she stepped into the elevator, the weight of her destruction would fully settle in. But this wasn't over. Laura might have been removed from the company, but the damage she had done still lingered beneath the surface. The fraudulent contracts, the stolen funds, the internal enablers who had allowed it to happen, there was still more to uncover. And Ethan wasn't the kind of man to leave a job half-finished. He didn't just want Laura out. He wanted to make sure that every single person who had helped her, knowingly or not, was held accountable. He turned his chair toward the floor-to-ceiling windows of his office, the city stretching out beneath him in a vast, glittering expanse. From this height, everything seemed orderly, controlled. But the real battle wasn't outside. It was within the walls of his own company. Laura had been a symptom of a larger problem, and now that she was gone, it was time to cut out the rot completely. A sharp knock on his door pulled him from his thoughts. Victor stepped inside, his face unreadable, but there was a new tension in his posture that told Ethan whatever he was about to say wasn't good. "She's not going quietly," Victor said without preamble. Ethan exhaled slowly, unsurprised. "What's she doing?" "Lawyers. She's already making calls, claiming wrongful termination, preparing to fight back. And that's not all." Victor set a folder down on Ethan's desk. "We just flagged an attempted breach, less than an hour after she was locked out. Someone tried to access restricted financial records from an external location. They didn't get through, but they knew exactly where to look." Ethan's fingers tightened slightly on the armrest of his chair. "Laura." Victor shook his head. "Not directly. Someone else inside the company is still feeding her information." Ethan's gaze darkened. He had expected Laura to try to claw her way back, but this wasn't desperation. This was strategy. She wasn't just throwing a fit over losing her job. She was making calculated moves, trying to protect herself and whatever leverage she thought she still had. That meant one thing: she wasn't working alone. "She's trying to cover her tracks," Ethan said quietly. "Or worse, trying to take something down with her." Victor nodded. "Exactly. And that's why we need to move fast." Ethan opened the folder Victor had brought, scanning the network logs, the flagged attempts, the access points that had been used. The breach had come from an executive-level clearance, someone with the ability to override security protocols before they had been locked down. That meant Mark Deo. Ethan didn't waste time. He grabbed his phone and called Marcus in finance. The CFO answered on the first ring, his voice clipped with tension. "I assume you've seen what's happening," Marcus said without greeting. "I have," Ethan said. "How deep does this go?" Marcus hesitated. "Deep." Ethan exhaled sharply. "Give me specifics." Laura was laundering money. Yes, but Deo was the one orchestrating it from the inside. He's been rerouting company funds through third-party accounts for nearly a year. Some of it was small enough to stay under the radar, but when Laura came in, she helped scale it up. Bigger contracts, bigger amounts, hidden behind multiple shell corporations. The moment you cut her off, he knew it was only a matter of time before we traced it back to him. Ethan's jaw tightened. "Where is he now?" "Still in the building," Marcus said. "Probably trying to find a way out before you get to him." Ethan stood smoothly, his mind already moving 3 steps ahead. "Not happening." Victor was already reaching for his radio. "I'll have security hold him." Ethan shook his head. "No, not yet." Victor gave him a questioning look, but Ethan was already moving, stepping out of his office with a quiet, measured pace. He didn't need Deo panicking. He needed him cornered. When Ethan entered the executive wing, the tension in the air was palpable. People weren't sure what was happening, but they could feel the shift, the underlying current of something unraveling. Employees moved cautiously, glancing at him as he passed, sensing that whatever was coming next was going to be significant. He found Deo in his office, standing near his desk with his phone in hand. The moment Ethan stepped inside, Mark stiffened, his grip on the phone tightening slightly before he slowly set it down. "Ethan," he said, forcing an easy smile. "To what do I owe the pleasure?" Ethan didn't return the smile. He closed the door behind him with deliberate ease, letting the silence stretch just long enough to make Deo shift uncomfortably. "I think we both know why I'm here," Ethan said finally, his voice calm, almost conversational. Mark let out a short, breathy laugh. "If this is about Laura." "This is about you," Ethan interrupted smoothly. Laura was sloppy. You weren't. But you should have known better than to think that would be enough. Deo's face paled slightly, but he recovered quickly, shaking his head. You don't have anything on me. Ethan tilted his head slightly, studying him. That's what you're betting on. He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a small USB drive, setting it on Deo's desk with a quiet click. Everything. Every transaction, every signature, every authorization code you thought you buried under layers of misdirection. You were careful, but you weren't invisible. Deo's throat bobbed as he swallowed. You wouldn't go public with this, he said after a beat, trying to sound confident. Not without risking the company's reputation. You'd lose investors, clients. Ethan leaned forward slightly. You think I built this company by being afraid to make hard decisions? Silence stretched between them. Then, finally, Deo exhaled, rubbing a hand over his face. What do you want? Ethan's lips curved slightly, but there was no amusement in his eyes. Resignation. Effective immediately. And a full confession to our legal team. Deo let out a slow breath. And if I refuse? Ethan didn't blink. Then I turn this over to the authorities. He straightened, smoothing his sleeves. Either way, Mark, you're done. Deo stared at him for a long moment, his mind clearly racing through every possible escape route. But there wasn't one, not anymore. Finally, his shoulders slumped, the fight draining out of him. I'll have my resignation on your desk by the end of the day, he muttered. Ethan nodded once. Good. He turned and left without another word, already moving on to the next phase. Laura had been removed. Deo had been neutralized. But this wasn't just about punishing those responsible. This was about making sure nothing like this ever happened again. And for that, he had one more step to take. As he walked back to his office, he pulled out his phone and dialed. Give me the legal team, he said. We're going to rewrite the rules. Chapter 7. The New Order. Ethan had seen people like Laura before. People who believed that control was something they could take rather than something they had to earn. He had seen them claw their way up the corporate ladder by intimidation and manipulation, pushing people aside, leaving behind nothing but resentment and broken trust. But what separated Laura from the rest was that she had convinced herself she was untouchable, that she could walk into a company she didn't build, twist systems to suit her own needs, and walk away without consequence when things started to fall apart. That belief had been shattered the moment she stepped into his office and saw the weight of the evidence against her. But he knew Laura well enough now to understand that she wouldn't go down without a fight. People like her didn't know how to surrender. He was right. It had been less than 24 hours since she had been escorted out of the building, and already she was making her next move. The first sign came in the form of a legal notice, a formal letter from a high-powered attorney claiming wrongful termination, defamation, and breach of contract. Laura wasn't just trying to get back at him. She was trying to force her way back into the company through sheer legal pressure. Ethan barely glanced at the document before tossing it onto his desk. He had expected something like this. Laura wasn't the kind of person who disappeared quietly. A lawsuit, no matter how weak, was her attempt to make herself relevant again. She was counting on him seeing it as a threat, on him wanting to settle quickly to avoid a legal battle. But she had miscalculated. Ethan didn't settle with frauds. He picked up his phone and called Jennifer Carter, the company's general counsel. Jennifer had been handling corporate law for longer than Laura had been climbing the ranks of businesses she had no right to be in, and if there was one person who could dismantle a lawsuit before it even reached a courtroom, it was her. Laura's suing, he said the moment she picked up. Jennifer let out a short laugh, unsurprised. Of course she is. She's probably desperate enough to try anything at this point. I want it shut down before it gains traction, Ethan said. Find every clause, every breach of policy, every violation she committed. I don't just want her case dismissed. I want her blacklisted. I want her name to be the first thing that comes up when companies search for corporate fraud. Jennifer hummed thoughtfully. That won't be difficult. She breached so many policies that the case will fall apart the moment a judge looks at the records. But she's not just doing this for money. She's trying to drag this out, force you into negotiations, make it look like she has a leg to stand on. If she can create enough doubt, she might convince a few people that she was wronged. Ethan exhaled slowly, considering the bigger picture. Laura was trying to make noise, to create a spectacle where none should exist. She knew she had lost the real battle, but if she could twist the narrative, make herself a victim, she might still salvage something from the wreckage. That meant she needed attention, and he wasn't going to give it to her. Fine, he said. Then we do the opposite of what she wants. No public response, no statements, no engagement. Let her scream into the void. Meanwhile, I want every department moving forward with the internal overhaul. I want new compliance protocols, mandatory fraud training, and an internal audit team that reports directly to me. We don't just recover from this. We make sure it never happens again. Jennifer's approval was clear in her voice. Consider it done. Ethan ended the call and leaned back in his chair, his mind already shifting toward the next problem. Laura's lawsuit was an inconvenience, but it wasn't a real threat. What mattered now was ensuring that no one like her ever got that close to his company again. But Laura wasn't finished. That evening, a news article surfaced, an anonymous tip claiming that a former executive had been forced out after uncovering financial misconduct at the company. The article didn't name Laura directly, but the implication was obvious. She was trying to flip the story, painting herself as a whistleblower instead of a fraud. It was a last-ditch effort to rewrite reality, to make herself look like the victim of corporate corruption rather than the architect of it. Ethan's first instinct was to shut it down immediately, to have his PR team release a statement, to push back against the lie before it gained traction. But then he stopped himself. That was exactly what Laura wanted. She was baiting him, hoping he would engage so that she could drag the fight into the public eye. Instead, he let the silence do the work. Over the next few days, the news cycle moved on. Laura's desperate attempt to control the narrative fell flat without the response she had been banking on. No one took the claims seriously, and without tangible evidence, the article was dismissed as just another attempt at reputation damage by a disgruntled former employee. And then, the final blow came. Jennifer called him 2 weeks later, a rare note of amusement in her usually serious tone. Laura's lawsuit has been dismissed. Ethan didn't even look up from his desk. Not surprised. That's not the interesting part, Jennifer said. The interesting part is that Deo flipped on her. He cut a deal with the prosecution, gave them everything they needed to pursue a criminal case against her. That made Ethan pause. Laura had been so focused on trying to salvage what was left of her career that she hadn't realized her former ally had already turned against her. Deo, knowing that he couldn't escape accountability, had made the smart move. He had cooperated in exchange for a reduced sentence, feeding the authorities everything they needed to go after Laura with full force. Ethan allowed himself a small smile. What are the charges? Wire fraud, falsifying financial records, and conspiracy to commit embezzlement, Jennifer said, her satisfaction clear. Not only is she blacklisted, but she's looking at serious time. Ethan nodded, absorbing the finality of it. Laura had spent her entire career stepping on people, manipulating them, using them to advance herself. But in the end, she had been abandoned by the very system she had tried to exploit. There was no grand finale, no dramatic last stand. She simply ceased to matter. As he hung up the phone, Ethan exhaled slowly, rolling his shoulders to shake off the lingering weight of the past few weeks. It was over. The company was stronger, more secure, and the message was clear: this would never happen again. Laura had walked into his company thinking she could rewrite the rules to suit herself. She had walked out with nothing, and that was the way it would stay. Chapter 8, The New Dawn. Ethan sat alone in his office, the city skyline stretching out before him, glowing against the darkened sky. The battle was over, the chaos settled into silence. Yet, the weight of everything that had happened still lingered in the air. It was an exhaustion that he felt. He had long since learned how to function under pressure, how to weather storms without losing his focus. But this was something else, something colder, a lingering awareness of just how close his company had come to being compromised from the inside. He had spent years building this place from the ground up, structuring it to be as airtight as possible. And yet, someone like Laura Bennett had still managed to infiltrate it, leaving behind fractures that would take time to mend. He had won. That much was undeniable. Laura was finished. She had burned every bridge, exhausted every option, and was now facing a reality she had never prepared for, a world where she had no control, no leverage, and no future. Deo's cooperation with the authorities had sealed her fate, ensuring that whatever ambitions she still clung to would remain just that, fantasies. And yet, As satisfying as her downfall had been, Ethan didn't waste time celebrating it. There was no real victory in destroying someone who had already made themselves irrelevant. What mattered now was moving forward, ensuring that nothing like this ever happened again. His company wasn't just surviving this, it was evolving. The internal audits had already been completed, sweeping through every department with ruthless efficiency. Every outdated security measure, every potential vulnerability had been analyzed, reinforced, or eliminated entirely. The compliance team had been expanded, with new protocols in place to ensure no contract could be approved without multiple layers of verification. The finance department had undergone a full restructuring, stripping out anyone who had been complicit in Laura and Deo's fraud, whether knowingly or through negligence. The company wasn't just recovering, it was becoming stronger, sharper, and more disciplined. Ethan had never been the type to micromanage, but for the first time in a long while, he found himself directly involved in the day-to-day operations, seeing everything with a precision that some might have mistaken for paranoia. But it wasn't paranoia, it was control. He was rebuilding his company on his terms, with his vision, and this time, there would be no weak links. A quiet knock on the door pulled him from his thoughts. Jennifer stepped inside, a folder in hand, her expression unreadable. "Thought you'd want to see this," she said, setting the folder on his desk. Ethan opened it, scanning the contents. It was a list, Laura's name was on it, followed by a series of blacklisted employment records. Every major firm in their industry, every significant corporation with influence, had received a full report of her misconduct, her fraud, her attempt to manipulate the legal system to claw her way back. She wasn't just unemployable, she was erased. "She's done," Jennifer said, watching him closely. "No one will touch her. She'll try to make noise, but no one's listening anymore." Ethan closed the folder and set it aside. "Good." Jennifer hesitated for a moment. "You don't seem satisfied." Ethan exhaled slowly, leaning back in his chair. "I'm not interested in what happens to her now. She was never the real problem. She was just the symptom." Jennifer nodded, understanding what he meant. "And the problem?" "Complacency," Ethan said, his voice quiet but with a sharpness beneath it. "She got in because people weren't paying attention. Because some of the wrong people had too much power, and some of the right people didn't speak up when they should have. That's what I'm fixing." Jennifer studied him for a moment before nodding. "Then I'll leave you to it." As she left, Ethan turned his gaze back to the skyline. He had learned a long time ago that power wasn't about control. It was about foresight, about understanding what could go wrong before it ever had the chance to. He had built this company with that principle. But somewhere along the way, other people had stopped thinking like that. They had let things slip through the cracks, assuming everything was secure simply because it had never failed before. That was the kind of thinking that got people like Laura through the door. That was the kind of thinking that made systems vulnerable. Not anymore. This company was his. He had built it, he had defended it, and now he was remaking it into something even stronger, even more impenetrable. Laura Bennett would be nothing more than a footnote in its history, a warning, a lesson, but ultimately irrelevant. And Ethan Cross never made the same mistake twice. Thank you for taking the time to listen to today's story on Store of Good Stories. If this story touched your heart or made you think, don't forget to hit like and share the video to spread this positive message to more people. And if this is your first time here, make sure to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you won't miss any of the meaningful stories we share every week. Your support is the biggest motivation for Store of Good Stories to keep bringing heartfelt and valuable stories to you. See you in the next video.